Much of America's involvement in the Second World War was in the Pacific theater, which we've already talked about, but we can't ignore the European theater. Now, you'll remember, hopefully, from sophomore year, that Hitler took over the bulk of Europe in 1938, 39, and 1940. In 1941, Hitler was recovering from the Battle of Britain, the air battle, and also the Blitz. In summer of 1941, after neither of those had worked, Hitler turned his attention towards Russia. He had a failed invasion of Russia in that he wasn't able to take the capital city, Moscow. And in 1942, he regroups and heads towards Stalingrad. The city of Stalingrad was a very strategic choice because, one, it is named after Stalin, who is kind of Hitler's nemesis. Two, it's an industrialized city, and it would hurt the Russian war effort. And three, it was located near lots of oil fields. And these were things that Hitler wanted. What Hitler didn't take into account was the Russian winter and the huge resource that is the Russian people. Ultimately, the city of Stalingrad is just about leveled. The Soviet Union loses about 1.2 million soldiers, either through being killed or being wounded. But additionally, there's about 40,000 Soviet civilians who are killed. The Germans only lose 850,000, but their population is so much smaller, and their military, while they put the bulk of the German military effort towards Stalingrad, it ends up being a massive defeat for the Germans. Here is our Seuss cartoon for this. Now, really, in addition to the psychological aspect of wanting to defeat Stalin on his eponymous city, what Hitler really wants is the oil. He needs the oil to continue waging war, but we see that there's going to be this massive loss of life in order for Hitler to try and achieve this. But he isn't able to because of Stalin and how Russia has industrialized. The 5-year plans that Stalin had begun in the 1920s were to get Russia industrialized. Now, while Russia's military was not as technologically as advanced as the Germans, they are at least able to fight back, and they are able to outlast the German military. Also in 1942, we see the North African theater of the war, which is kind of grouped into the European theater. It starts to heat up a bit. The British had already been fighting the Germans in North Africa, and this is because primarily of the territories belonging to France that Germany was able to take over in 1940. But from the American perspective, we're going to get Generals Eisenhower and Patton, who are going to be involved in this campaign. And there they are, Patton on the left, Eisenhower on the right. Let me just go back to this map for a moment. The Americans were working sort of in northwestern Africa to try and take back territory. And the ultimate goal of Operation Torch, the name of this plan, is to secure North Africa and use it as a launching point in order to invade Europe. And that was because it was thought that the southern part of Europe was the weakest point. They called it the soft underbelly. It wasn't as heavily guarded as the northern border, the northern shores. And part of that is because it was the Italians primarily, not the Germans. And this is going to work to our advantage, to the advantage of the Allies, because Hitler is trying to do too much. He is trying to take over in Russia. He is trying to take over parts of the Middle East. He's trying to take over and hold on to control of North Africa. And he still hasn't quite gotten over that he hasn't taken control of Britain. But in having his attention so divided, he ends up not doing an excellent job at any of them. This is where one of my favorite parts of World War II comes into play. A top secret plan called Operation Mincemeat. The British wanted to convince the Germans that the invasion that would take place in the south of Europe, the soft underbelly, would take place in Greece, even though the most likely place for it to happen is in Italy. The guy who comes up with this plan is a young naval officer named Ian Fleming, who would go on to write the James Bond novels. What happened with this plan is the naval intelligence found a corpse, and they had created an entire identity for this person. This person had theater ticket stubs and had a note from his girlfriend, and they created this whole life so that when this body was picked up, that the information it carried would be believable. They planned to make it look like there was a plane crash, but what they did instead was the body was put into sort of this sealed container, and here are two of the guys who helped plan it. They're driving the body to the coast to put it on a submarine, and a submarine would launch this capsule, and the body would land on the beaches of Spain. Spain was technically neutral, but it was fascist, just like Germany. And attached to this body would be a briefcase with documents, and the documents would suggest that the invasion of Europe would take place in Greece, not in Italy. And it's such a cool story, and it's all true. And it works. With this information, Hitler believes it and starts directing the German troops to Greece, which makes it more possible for the invasion of Sicily beginning in 1942 and into 1943. This is a joint effort between the US and the British. They have to get to Sicily first before they can get to the main part of Italy. That will happen in 1943. And this part of the war isn't particularly famous, but it doesn't mean it was any less cruel. The geography of Italy, it's very rocky, very sort of lots of small mountains. So that takes a long time for the Allied forces to be able to work their way north. But they do get a little bit of help from the Partigiani. The Partigiani are partisans. These are Italian citizens who are on the side of the Allies. They don't like the fascist rule in their country. And so these are civilians, sort of local militias, who turn out to assist the Americans and the British. Finally, the Allied forces are able to reach Rome on June 4th, 1944, the same day as the D-Day landings on the beaches of Normandy. That was part of Operation Overlord. Remember, the soft underbelly was southern Europe because the northern part of Europe was so well defended. Hitler had established what he called the Atlantic Wall, a series of forts protecting the northern sea coast. Just like with Operation Mincemeat, the Allies wanted to convince the Germans that an attack would be happening elsewhere. The most logical place to launch an invasion of France would be at Dover and over to Calais. It is the smallest distance. It's about 20 miles. And this would make the most sense. The English and the Americans were involved in plans to sort of convince the Germans of this. But the real plan was to go to the beaches of Normandy. General Eisenhower was put in control of this operation, Operation Overlord. And he wants to inspire these men who are engaging in taking back Europe, bringing to free Europe from the grip of Nazi rule. And so here we see him talking to paratroopers on the 3rd of June, the day before the invasion, and these soldiers were going to be dropped into occupied France later that night. Additionally, General Eisenhower wrote a letter and also had it broadcasted so that all of the American Allied soldiers could sort of understand where he was coming from. General Eisenhower said, "Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, You are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. He will fight savagely. But this is the year 1944. Much has happened since the Nazi triumphs of 1940 and 41. The United Nations have inflicted upon the Germans great defeats in open battle, man to man. Our air offensive has seriously reduced their strength in the air and their capacity to wage war on the ground. Our home fronts have given us an overwhelming superiority in weapons and munitions of war and placed at our disposal great reserves of trained fighting men. The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking. The men who landed on the beaches at Normandy knew that this was a big deal. So D-Day is June 6, 1944, 2 days after Rome is taken. The British, the Americans, and some Canadian forces land on these beaches at Normandy. And while it is an incredibly bloody day, by the end of the day, we secure the beachhead, which means we can now unload all of our material, our tanks, more and more troops. And we can begin the process of taking back Europe. This was because we did not want this to be the reality of Europe. We did not want Hitler to continue to have control. The Americans and British worked their way across France, and they reached Paris in August of 1944. At this point, the American and British forces are equidistant from Berlin as the Soviet forces. And while we are on the same team, we do not like the idea of the Soviets winning. So it becomes a race to get to Berlin. We have allied with Soviet Russia simply out of necessity. We do not like Stalin's ideology. The next major battle is the Battle of the Bulge in winter of 44 and 45. The British and Americans were in the Ardennes forests in Belgium. And it's known as the Battle of the Bulge because the German line was able to sort of squeeze a divide between the British and the Americans. You can see that bulge on the map. And what Hitler is hoping to do is sort of a divide and conquer strategy. And at first, it seems to be working. The problem with this battle is the weather, is the season. It becomes very, very cold and snowy. And so that means that Allied forces were not able to provide air cover. And so for a few weeks, it is truly just the Germans versus the Americans and British on the ground in the snow. But then the weather clears, the Allied air forces can provide air cover. They're able to cut off the German supply lines. And in January of 1945, we are able to cross over into Germany. Then, in February of 1945, the city of Dresden is bombed. Dresden is it's probably like the 7th largest city in Germany, and it hadn't been targeted yet. And what the Americans are trying to demonstrate is not cruelty, but trying to suggest that the Germans surrender. Now here's a modern picture of the city. It was rebuilt to look like it had before the war, but this is what Dresden looked like after the firebombing. In particular, these are fire bombs, incendiary bombs that cause fire and spread fire, and air is sucked in to feed this fire, so it's incredibly destructive. There is a large civilian loss of life. And the Allies are trying to make the point to Germany that there really isn't a point in continuing to fight, because for the last few years, the Germans have not had any military successes. Additionally, the Americans used this to sort of demonstrate to Stalin that we're not going to play nice, that we are willing to fight, and we will fight Stalin if we have to once this war is over. We want to demonstrate our power. In April of 1945, President Roosevelt dies. He had served for more than 3 terms. He died of a brain aneurysm. So when he dies, his vice president becomes president. That is Harry S. Truman. Also in April of 1945 is the Battle of Berlin. It was the Soviets who reached Berlin first, and for most of the month of April, the Soviets are fighting with what's left of the German army on the Eastern Front to take over the city bit by bit. Now, Hitler for several months had been living in a bunker, the Führer bunker, but on April 30th decided that it was a lost cause and he commits suicide. Today, this is all that's left of the Führer bunker. It was entirely destroyed so as not to leave any sort of remnant or a place where he could be thought of as a martyr. But with this, the Soviets have taken over Berlin. Just a few days after, what is left of the German command decides to surrender, and we celebrate Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day, on May 8th. So this was huge, that finally this first phase of the war is over. It had been going on since the late 30s, and there is a degree of elation, of relief in America. But we still were fighting in the Pacific theater.